We are live. All right, now I'm going to share my screen.
Announcements are now going out to thousands of our subscribers that the live stream is starting, but we won't really begin the program for another 10 minutes.
Okay.
But meanwhile, lots and lots of people will be logging in. Announcement.
There we go. My apologies. I just had to turn off one of the windows. Did I just? Yeah.
That's such a great logo. I love that logo.
Wait till it starts the animation portion, which was programmed by one of our viewers named Anderson Chadwick, based on an idea I created a couple of decades ago and programmed myself much more crudely.
Yeah, and it's got a three-dimensionality to it, which is really well done. Because it's never seen the circles inside the yin yang as cones like that before.
That's true. That was sort of a innovation.
It's going to hypnotize me here. You don't want that, do you?
It is hypnotic. I'm sorry.
Well, then we'll get all the real answers out of you, Diane. No, you'll tell us anyway.
This is part of your strategy, eh?
Part of our parlor tricks.
Yeah.
Well,
we think it's meditative, right, Jeff? It's a meditative.
Yeah. The idea is that while the colors are rotating and the image is rotating, that all along the S curve in the center, the colors are the complementary colors on each side of the curve.
Mm-hmm.
We have Kevin Kahn in the chat, I see, who's been a guest on New Thinking Aloud.
Kevin has been a guest several times. He considers himself a high-performing autistic person, and he is the collaborator with Jeffrey Kripal on one of Kripal's newest books called How to Think Impossibly. And when I told Jeffrey I would love to interview him about the book, he said, well, you should really interview Kevin as well because of the important contributions that he made. And I think Jeffrey Kripal's attitude was that autistic people have a unique ability to understand things that most of mainstream culture considers impossible.
Yeah, well, I would say that they live it.
Yeah. So Kevin has developed a unique philosophy he calls Platonic surrealism.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than the shadows in the cave, it's like a multicolored, multidimensional, surreal existence.
Mm-hmm. And in Kevin's case, he correlates it with such things as summoning UFOs.
Ah, the psionics.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All of that. Kevin has a lot of insights into that realm, which is, of course, next to the topic of autistic savants, psionic assets summoning UFOs is on our channel certainly one of the most popular topics.
Yeah, yeah, and my name has come up in both arenas. I don't know if you knew that or not.
No, I didn't, Diane. I'd be very interested to learn more.
Yeah. Well, so I'm doing research with an entity called ANIA, and ANIA is sort of the parent company under which Skywatcher is, and Skywatcher.
That's Jake Barber.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And Jake Barber in an interview said that I was on his Skywatcher team, but it was like, and and I was surprised when I heard him say that because I'm not on his team, but I'm one of the scientists besides Gary Nolan who's been recruited to start studying it. I haven't really been studying it as of yet, but I've been recruited to help with doing the scientific studies.
Well, whoever recruited you was very smart. You're the right person uh, for that. Are you able to say who it was who recruited you?
Well, I mean, Alex Klokas, who's the person who's the funder of ENIA, but he's
Uh-huh,
also working with other funders,
uh-huh.
so he's been very active in trying to bring about disclosure,
Hmm.
coming from a non-government sort of private sector.
Hmm. Well, I uh, think that's very exciting.
Yeah, I would love that could be a whole other interview or conversation for sure when you're
I
ready.
I think before the year is out, I imagine we'll have many more conversations with people about what psionic assets and who they are and what they've been doing and what successes or failures they've had so far.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is going to be a year with a lot of disclosure. I mean, it's that to me is, I mean, that's very evident that
Mhm.
that and so and it's important it gets done right.
Mhm. Well, in fact, I happen to have an interview that has been recorded and edited, hasn't yet been released with a UFO researcher you may know of named Grant Cameron, who's been following your work very, very carefully. He published a book called UFO Sky Pilots about interviews with some 34 people who claim that they've actually had the experience of piloting a UFO. And they claim the UFOs pretty much to a person. The UFOs are like conscious entities themselves, and the piloting is all done telepathically. Uh,
Yes, I've heard that. I've
uh-huh.
heard.
And he says it's just like the autistic savants that have been featured in your work. It took about 10 minutes out of that interview to talk about the telepathy tapes. So
Yeah, it seems like
it's
yeah. Yeah, it seems a lot of people are talking about it.
interesting how these two topics are coming together somehow. Uh, and I guess what brings them together is the apparent, very accurate psychic functioning that you've encountered with these autistic children.
Well, I mean, I was told by various scientists over a decade ago when they found out I was doing research on telepathy with autistic kids that telepathy is really very critical to the whole disclosure um, effort, and the reason for that being that the communication is always telepathic. The non-human intelligence never speaks the way that you and I are speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
And
Jeffrey.
it's yeah, and it's just interesting because it's like there's this language is irrelevant, which is what you see with these autistic kids that they can be telepathic with someone that doesn't even have the same primary language.
Mm.
I was just going to mention, you might know, Diane, that Jeff studied a man, Ted Owens, for 10 years, wrote a book, The PK Man, who was able to work with his mind and influence weather events, calling up UAP and so forth, and that he's actually working on a documentary film about it right now as well.
That's great. Yeah, psychokinesis is another hot topic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Which it's a hot topic on the one hand, and it certainly falls within the domain of parapsychology. But in my experience, most parapsychologists would prefer to avoid it.
Why do you think that is?
It's frightening if you begin to look at the potential for psychokinesis to, for example, stop a person's heart, or the idea that they expressed in that movie, Men Who Stare at Goats. You could it's associated with witchcraft and
Mhm.
things that were so frightening to people that 250 years ago we burned witches at the stake, and today we say, oh, there is no such thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that the idea that somebody else might be able to control something that you thought that you had full agency over is, I could see how that for sure would be frightening to people.
And telepathy is much the same way. Anyhow, we're now live. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, host of the New Thinking Aloud channel. I'm with my co-host, Emmy Vadnais,
Hello,
and
everybody.
our special guest, Diane Hennacy Powell, who was author of the ESP Enigma, who was prominently featured in the popular podcast, The Telepathy Tapes. Welcome, Diane. It's a joy to be with you once again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And of course, the viewers are already pouring in questions. Your work has become, I would say at this point, practically notorious. And,
Very popular.
but I think a good starting point would be, would you like to make an opening statement to sort of set the stage, and then we'll start taking questions from our viewers.
Well, my opening statement would be that approximately 20 years ago, I put out the hypothesis that if anybody could prove psi abilities to the extent that science would demand it, it would be an autistic savant. And after putting out that hypothesis, I started getting contacted by families from all around the world saying that they had a child who had special abilities. And the most common ability that they reported was telepathy, but they've also reported things like precognition and then also seeing deceased individuals. And so I've focused primarily on the telepathy aspect of things because with precognition, you never know the time frame under which that event is going to occur. And so I thought that telepathy is something that you can demonstrate in real time. So, and then I met Kai Dickens 4 years ago, and she was heard me on a podcast, became intrigued by my research, wanted to see some experiments, and was blown. She and her camera crew were blown away, and so that's what resulted in the telepathy tapes.
It was surprising how that particular podcast went right up to the top, I believe, on the Apple Podcasts list. How do you account for that success?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it premiered in September, and by Christmas Day, it was #1 in the English-speaking world, not just on Apple, but on Spotify, all of these other, streaming apps. How do I account for that popularity? Well, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, there's high production quality to it. It's a fascinating topic. The you're hearing the you're hearing from the parents and teachers and other professionals directly in their voice, telling the stories about what they experienced and why their paradigm shifted. And these children are so misunderstood that it really brings your heart in when you start to realize that you have these individuals who are highly intelligent, but they are looked upon by so much of society as mentally retarded and treated that way. I mean, because they really have a poor motor control over their body, and as a result, they can't communicate in the ways that we communicate, and so then people just assume that there's nothing really going on in terms of their cognitive function, and so people it really appeals to you as well as as a humanist who really cares about children and cares about the parent-child bond. And so there's all of these elements to it besides the parapsychological ones. And so I think there's that aspect to it. I think that we're living at a time now when you have a high percentage of people who already believe in these things. They're just waiting for some good science to demonstrate it in a way that is going to move the needle, because we know that parapsychologists have been at this for a long time, and things have shifted certainly over the last 10 years. I'm pleased to see that, but you still have a lot of entrenched materialists.
Yeah, and a lot of people are experiencing autism or are parents of autistic children, and can be a very misunderstood experience that people are going through. Jeff, were you going to say something?
Well, we have a question it was given to me in advance by a researcher who was really eager to know. Ed Kellogg is a dream researcher, a specialist in lucid dreaming, and a very talented lucid dreamer himself, who sees a correlation between lucid dreaming and psychic functioning. And he wanted to know if you have any reports at all about the dream life of these autistic savants.
Well, they've had dreams in which they're precognitive, for example. A dream in which one child had a dream in which this was something reported by Bernie Rimlin, a dream in which her father died of a heart attack at the dinner table, and he died of the heart attack at the dinner table the next day. There's a child who's part of the podcast who had a dream that her father slipped on the ice and broke his hip. And they lived in Arizona. And so it was kind of like, well, that's very unlikely. But then he went on a business trip and at some place where they had winter weather, and he slipped on the ice and broke his hip and ended up in the hospital. So I've certainly seen that. I've certainly also, heard of what's interesting is of them entering other people's lucid dreams.
Mm.
And so for those of us who are neurotypical, it's in that lucid dream that maybe we can enter that space that I think that these children kind of live in during their waking life.
Mm.
And what I wonder is whether or not their waking life is so similar to a lucid dream that it's even hard to ask them, are you having lucid dreams? Because they'd be like, what are you talking about? I mean, it's whereas for us, it's a remarkable thing when we have a dream in which we realize it's a dream while we're in it, and then can gain control over what happens in the dream.
It sounds like a form of dream sharing and just different states of consciousness, perhaps. You're suggesting, Diane, that they're kind of is, and that's true probably for all of us. A dream world is just a different state of consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Dream. Yes. I mean, I tend to think of it, and this is a very simplistic way of expressing it, but that think of it as having two modalities in which we operate. And so there's the modality that is our waking consciousness. And that's the modality in which most of us have this sense of separation from everything. And we have all of these rules and expectations about what can and cannot happen. And then we have, when we are in dreaming sleep, those rules and expectations go away. All kinds of things can happen in the dream that we wouldn't experience during waking life. And and that includes oftentimes receiving information that is, what we would call, non-local information, such as the dream of something that's going to happen in the future, or a after-death communication where there's this individual that the person's close to and they die, and you have a dream of them that night. So there's something about dreaming that seems to be more conducive to psi. And I think it's because if you look at the brain function, I mean, it's the reverse of what's going on during waking life. In waking life, the left hemisphere is more dominant, and during the dreaming sleep, the right hemisphere is more dominant. And and the frontal lobes shut down during dreaming sleep, and so you're not having that judgment about what can and cannot be. And so what I hypothesize is that individuals who seem to be really psychic during their waking life, that it could be that they're in kind of this, it's where they've got both modes kind of operating simultaneously, and able to, they kind of merge, as opposed to being that, separate like they are in us.
Oh, that's fascinating. We had Jill Bolte Taylor on, who's a neuroanatomist and had a stroke. And essentially, she talks about how she had her left side of her brain wiped out. And she did find that she lost her ability to speak, her language ability, her sense of identity, and just felt a oneness with everything. And really, what she said she sensed was energy. And so, and then she was very well known for her book, My Stroke of Insight. And then she wrote a second book called Whole Brain Living, which talks about a lot of what you just said, Diane.
Yeah, exactly. So the loss of the ability to speak, I mean, that sounds like that stroke temporarily put her into a state of being that is so similar to these autistic individuals. It could be, it could be that we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Here's a question from a viewer whose YouTube name is Veritas777, who asked, could Dr. Powell explain how the non-speakers come to know each other, form relationships, and afterwards relate to others, the nature and content of their interactions with each other?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, this is all speculation, but what I really believe is happening with the non-speakers is that they they are people who were developing normally and then they regressed, and usually that regression occurs before the age of 2, and so what happens is that they never really go through that stage of separation individuation. And they also have these sensory issues. They don't really know where their body is in space, particularly their hand. They also describe not really oftentimes feeling their mouth. I mean, knowing where you have to know where your tongue is in your mouth in order to articulate things. And so this proprioceptive problem, which is really the main cause of their motor difficulties, has given them less of a sense of embodiment. And so they're less identified with the self as our body. And so they never really go into that illusion of separateness, if you will. And I believe that they never really lose their connection with what some people might call source, or collective consciousness, or whatever that is, before we become embodied in this lifetime, that they continue to have that connection. And once you have that connection, then you have access to non-local information, you have access to other individuals, both in body and not in body. I mean, that's what to me is kind of the the explanation that seems to fit with their description of what they experience. And it makes sense to me on a theoretical basis because it really made me wonder if, we all come into the world with that sense of shared consciousness and connection to source, but we lose it as we become more and more identified with self in a very limited way.
Yeah, that's something that Jill Bolte Taylor talked about when I talked with her, is she said that language really flips us over out of that state of consciousness. And maybe that's why, for example, one of the primary ways, there are many ways, but to access these psychic intuitive abilities is to calm that part of the mind and get it's often referred to as the monkey mind or the chatter to calm so that we can perhaps open to greater aspects of our brain and even beyond the brain.
Yes, correct. Yeah, I think language plays a big role, and I wonder about things like a lot of people say, well, are these children, the sort of the future of human evolution, and they could be, but they could also be a throwback to, and there's, because it could be that our ancestors were all telepathic. There are people who've suggested that the Neanderthals were telepathic, and so how did humans um, communicate before language? And,
Mhm.
and so I think it may be that it's helping us to um, see a potential that's always been there latent in all of us that we lost touch with.
Mhm. Um, I'm wondering if we could just go to a question, Jeff, from one of our amazing, dedicated volunteers, Pablo Giralda, who asks, I think, a really great foundational question for those listening who might not be familiar with autism. If you could share a little bit about what is known about autism and how severe autistic brains differ from neurotypical brains. And of course, it's on a spectrum, isn't it? So not every autistic person is going to present exactly the same way, or because you've been studying this since the 1980s.
Correct. Yeah, I've been studying it since before it got labeled a spectrum, and I really actually disagree with the idea of labeling it a spectrum. Um, And so, because you have these individuals that you would never lump together as having the same condition. You have these, some of the people who are being diagnosed as autistic are individuals who have extremely high IQs, and they're very advanced. So and they're so advanced cognitively beyond their peers that they don't socialize with other children in the same way. I mean, I think that they're bored with other children. They'd rather sit there and read a book, when they're 5 years old than play with the other children or something along those lines. And so, and then you have these other children that are developing normally, and then something happens, but usually between the ages of, 12 months to 30 months that causes them to lose the language skills that they had already started to develop and some of their, fine motor skills. Um, and and then a lot of them don't feel well. And so they 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 are not they're just not able to function in the same, and so they once again are not, they're not interacting with other people. So if you look at what autism is, one of the problems is that psychiatry is not disease oriented, it is syndrome oriented. And so what that means is if you have a cluster of certain behaviors, emotions, and cognitive issues, whatever that pattern is, that syndrome gets labeled something. So for example, depression is a syndrome. Well, there's all kinds of causes of depression. It can be caused because you lost the love of your life, and it's just hard for you to get over that heartbreak. It could be that you have some genetic cause of it. It could be that you have a thyroid condition that causes your mood to be depressed, and so on. And so autism is no different from that. And if you look at what are the behaviors or cognitive styles that define autism, first of all, it is a developmental disorder. So it's something that begins early on in childhood. In order to be diagnosed autistic, you have to have had, well, you have people now who are retrospectively being diagnosed as autistic, but in general, it's something that you're going to want to see that whatever you're now diagnosing as autistic began in very, very early childhood. Um, and so what it is it's a developmental disorder in which their language is different from normal language acquisition. And that can take on multiple forms. There are children like Ramses who started reading when he was 4 months old. And by the time he was 2 years old, he could give you the alphabets and do some reading in 8 different languages as different as Arabic, Japanese, Russian, Spanish, Hebrew. Um, it was, I mean, astounding at the age of 2, and he could speak. And so his language abnormality wasn't that he couldn't speak. His language abnormality was that he was so precocious in his acquisition of language. And and it's not understood how he acquired all of those languages. And and also oftentimes the language difficulty is a quirky use of language. So for example, a lot of the initial children that I studied, they would reverse pronouns. In other words, if they always hear you refer to yourself as I, they will call you I. And if they always hear you refer to them as you, they'll refer to themselves as you.
Well, that makes sense, actually.
Yeah, yeah, they're treating that pronoun like it's the name. And so there's this kind of concrete nature to their thinking, and um, then the second aspect of autism is that there's something abnormal about their social development. And the name autism comes from autos, as in Latin for self. And so they seem self-absorbed. And it's that they tend to be less social, for whatever reason. There are a lot of reasons why a child is less social, or and their social development is aberrant in some way. Like they don't read social cues very easily. And it's hard for them to read the situations, um, and or facial expressions oftentimes.
And some of them have a hard time even being touched or held by their parents, right?
That's right. Yeah. So one of the first signs of aberrant social development is the lack of developing that social smile, which, when the baby goes from, well, it smiles when it's going to poop to, oh, now I'm smiling because you're my mom and I recognize you, and it creates a, heartfelt feeling, so that social smile. Um, and so then, the third part of the triad is that they engage in some kind of repetitive behavior. And so you'll see that some of these children are extremely obsessive compulsive. They may, line things up repeatedly, just over and over and over again. Um, Other children might engage in something like hand flapping, where they're just constantly doing some kind of rhythmic movement. Um, and so they have usually, the obsessive compulsive component to it, or the repetitive behaviors, are really a sign of high anxiety. If you spend much time with these children, you realize that it doesn't take much for them to get dysregulated and to be very, very upset. And a lot of them have heightened sensitivity to light and sound and how many people are in the room, and those sorts of things. But but that hypersensitivity isn't part of the diagnosis of autism, but I'd say that I generally see that in a very high percentage, certainly in the non-speaking population. I see that on a regular basis. So you have that triad, and if you think about it, it's just like, wow, there's a lot of range of variability in all of those different things. And the whole point behind the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual within psychiatry, was to have uniform diagnoses so that if I say autism, you know what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, um, if your experience of somebody who's autistic is somebody who is sort of an Albert Einstein type or, Bill Gates type, and that's your impression of what autism is, then if you were to look at one of these non-speakers, you'd be like, really, that's the same thing? And if what your exposure has been is predominantly the non-speaking population, then that's what you're going to think is autism. And yet the whole thing got lumped together. And I think that that was not done to aid science. I think that was just to make it more convenient for the pediatricians who are the ones who are they're the ones who are getting the assessments of the kids done first, where they come into the office, mom says something's not right. They go, okay, and then it just gives them a little checklist of, oh, okay, yeah, is this, is the language off? Yes. Is the socialization off? Yes. And do they do something repetitive? Okay, autism. And then they've got their diagnosis, and the problem is they all get treated as though they've got the same condition. And I think that it's probably multiple conditions. I mean, no two brains look alike. There's, practically every structure in the brain has been implicated. There's some way in which it's, larger or smaller, or, there's hyperconnectivity or reduced connectivity. I mean, there's just so many things. And you have Rain Man, who
I was thinking about that as you were talking. Yeah. That's
you
a
have
lot of what people maybe think of from many years ago, the movie with Tom Cruise. Yeah.
right.
And
And Kim Peek, who that's modeled after, he didn't have autism. He had a condition called hydrocephalus, in which the cerebral spinal fluid build up. And, there was something, about the flow of it that was interfered with, and it built up all of this pressure in his brain at a time that the fontanelles hadn't closed. And so he actually had a much larger head than most individuals because it pushed his skull bones out, and his head was so heavy that he couldn't even hold it upright. I mean, it's one of the reasons why you see pictures of him and his head's tilted. And if you look at his brain, in the center of it, there's this big hole. He doesn't even have the corpus callosum, which is the major bundle of fibers, axons that connect the left and the right hemisphere. And and this unique brain wiring, appears to have been, one of the reasons why he could read two books simultaneously, one with each eye. And so a lot of people think he was autistic, but if you look at what kinds of symptoms people have if they have this sort of congenital hydrocephalus, you'll see there's huge overlap with autism, such that I bet a lot of the kids who get diagnosed actually have hydrocephalus.
right. And so for you, you're suggesting that it's perhaps many different types of conditions why it can often be referred to as being on a spectrum with somebody who is perceived to be low functioning all the way up to high functioning.
Right. And this is why, I mean, to me, there's no surprise that people are like, well, we don't know what's causing it. Well, and we don't have effective treatments for it. Well, you're not going to know causation or treatment unless you have a really finely defined, really well-defined diagnosis, so that you know what you're talking about. And so when I look at these studies that are talking about, well, we took 50 kids that are autistic and did X, Y, Z, I'm just like, okay, yeah, what do you mean by autism? I know from being in the field that could be a lot of different things.
Yeah, and for you, you settled on or have researched a lot of autistic savants. So how is autistic savant different than, well, you're suggesting there's other conditions, but what a lot of people might think of as autism.
Well, so one of the things that really intrigued me is that there's something unique about autistic individuals such that you see savant syndrome more commonly in them than any other population. The other the other population which you see savant syndrome are people who are blind, very early on at in the the first year of life. And in the autistic population, savant syndrome is, maybe 10%. And the really prodigious savants like Kim Peek, it's a smaller percentage. And in the savant syndrome, they have something that they're able to do, something they know. Savant comes from savoir, meaning, to know. There's something that they know that you're like, well, how do they know that? I mean, how is it that this child who's never studied mathematics can do calendar calculation for thousands of years? It's like, uh, and for whatever reason, calendar calculation is something that a lot of them have as their savant skill because they obsess about calendars, and I suspect that that's because they experience time differently, and that they're trying to get kind of get a handle on that, and so anyway, but so back to your question about savants. I think that their their abilities are just so similar to these ESP abilities, psi abilities, and I wonder whether or not it's that they they are demonstrating to us that they have that a more of a condition that we're all born with, that we all are still connected to source, that we all still have this this view of things where there's more of a shared consciousness, where we really haven't identified with as a separate self yet. And during the first 4 years of life, when children are undergoing all of this shaping of their brain, there's this pruning process that's going on where as they're acquiring skills, there are cells in the brain called microglia that are pruning all of these redundant synapses, getting rid of the excessive neurons. They're really just shaping the brain, and if you have something happen like the loss of vision because of something like like glaucoma in the eye, severe glaucoma in the eyes or something, um, or you have the loss of language before you've really acquired language, then the brain is still very malleable and reshaping itself and rewiring itself. So it's and trying to find workarounds. So you can have these people that are blind from very early on that can learn how to navigate their world using echolocation, where they're emitting sounds, and then the way that sound bounces back at them gives them an idea of what their surroundings are, and then they can navigate very complex landscapes using that information. If they had gone blind, at the age of 4 or 5, they probably that probably wouldn't have developed because their brain is, their visual system is more devoted to vision. But we know that if it's taken offline from being part of the visual process, that it'll get used for something else, and so it becomes kind of like a auxiliary to the auditory function.
So you're suggesting that with these autistic savants or nonverbal or minimally verbal people that they have a heightened ability in these other regions of their brain and consciousness.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, as workarounds, I think that that we innately, as human beings, want to be in community and connected with others. We want to know, what's going on with my mom, what's going on with, these individuals around me. And if you don't have if you have your ability to communicate interrupted, then you're going to retain whatever innate, default communication method there is. And these kids, I've heard this story over and over again from parents. They say, my kid looks at me like, why aren't you reading my mind? I don't, they don't understand why it's sort of a one-way street. They're like, well, they're, and then there are some individuals who work with these kids who say that it starts to become more of a two-way street.
Fascinating.
We have a question from a viewer, Dave Williams, who wants to know, Diane, if you have ever had one of these non-speakers try to communicate with you telepathically.
No, I haven't. I can't say that I have. It'd be a very interesting experience. Well, let me say this. Okay, I have not had that experience with a non-speaker. Okay, but I did have a telepathic experience with somebody who was autistic, who was capable of speech. And what had happened was she was somebody who became my patient back when I was in practice in San Diego. She had never been properly diagnosed as being as autistic, and she was frequently misunderstood by people because she just thought differently. She responded to the world differently, and she was bullied when she was in school. And she had been even sexually abused by a brother-in-law, and so she was highly traumatized. And I was the only individual that she ever developed this bond with, but she could trust me. I was really safe for her. She couldn't let anybody touch her. She couldn't touch somebody else, but she felt safe with me such that she would reach out and touch my hand briefly like that, like testing, and it's like, oh, okay, that felt okay, as though, some individuals, if she were to touch them, it would, be painful for her. And so she really bonded to me. And what happened is that one day I went to the beach in La Jolla with some friends of mine to have a picnic, and the topic came up from a friend of mine. She said, um, I'm thinking that, I really want to check out Ashland, Oregon. I really think that it might be a great place to retire to. And my boyfriend at the time was like, oh, yeah, San Diego, the houses are too close together. I'd rather live someplace where you can have a house on more land. And so she said, well, will you be willing to go to Ashland and just check it out? And I said, yeah, I'd never been there before. And I said, okay, I'll go with you on a trip. So we're walking back to the car, and I get this panicked phone call from this patient. She says, Dr. Powell, she said, I just got into a panic attack because you're going to move away from San Diego. I just know you are. You're going to move away. And at the time, it was like just the beginning of a thought of just even looking at some other place. And then, and at the time, it was just like really not a thought out idea, no intention. I was pretty happy in San Diego in many ways. And then, and then lo and behold, within a year, I moved to San Diego. And so,
You mean Oregon?
yeah, I mean, it's not, yeah, I moved away from San Diego to Oregon. Yeah, thank you for catching that. Yeah. And so that was my first instance of it. And I think it's because of the bond that we had, whereas with these non-speakers that I've worked with, they all live somewhere else, and so I've never been able to spend as much time with them to develop anywhere near the kind of bond that I had with this patient. And because it develops over time. I mean, all of the people who say this child can read my mind, all of them are people that have spent countless hours with these children. It's not something that happens just like right away. And so these children are highly, they're highly accurate in their ability to do telepathy, but it seems to be more specific to individuals that they're bonded with.
Mhm. Because the experience that you recounted, fascinating, but it sounds like the sort of thing that one hears from many therapists talking about therapist-client telepathy. There are books about that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I had I had it happen the other way, in the sense that I had individuals that they're in psychotherapy session with me, and I'd only, maybe I'd only seen them maybe 5 times or whatever, and I would say to them, I'd have an insight, and I'd say, oh, well, this is due to, XYZ happening when you were 5 years old, and the patient would look at me like, and they'd go, how'd you know that? And I said, oh, well, you must have told me that during intake. No, no, Dr. Powell, that's something that I have never been able to bring up to a therapist. I was hoping to have the courage to bring that up. And I'd be like, oh, and I knew that, yeah, okay, if that was that anxious of a topic for you, then yeah, I mean, I guess you didn't bring it up. And that happened to me more than once. And so, and I think it's because I'm a strong empath. I truly cared about my patients, and I think that that's one of the things that made me very effective as their therapist.
They felt safe with you, and somehow, I know I've experienced this when you work closely with people, you can pick up on, of course, nonverbals, but that telepathic connection, it can just slip in at times. We have a person here, Rob, who's asking, how does Asperger's relate to autism, or what are your thoughts about Asperger's? And I think that that was also in the DSM, but changed a few years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, it's more than a few years ago. I mean,
Many years ago. Yeah.
yeah, that changed more than 11 years ago. Yeah, well, I mean, basically, so you had the whole diagnosis of autism really came from two people. You had Leo Kanner, who was at Johns Hopkins, my alma mater, the father of child psychiatry, who back in the 30s, he realized that there were these children who kept to themselves. They didn't really socialize with other people the same way. And it was based on 11 children. And of the children, 9 of them had the form of autism where they were highly intelligent, and but they were different from other children from early on. And then you had 2 of the children who had the regressed form, in which they were developing normally, and then something happened and they regressed. And then similarly, in Nazi Germany, you had someone, Asperger was a Nazi, and he was in the camps. He was, basically they were separating people out based on, oh, okay, this person is homosexual, this person is mentally deficient, this person is somebody that we could, use for this purpose. And, so they were assessing the people that were in the camps. And and Asperger realized that some of these individuals, there was something different about them, but it wasn't that they were mentally retarded. And so he saw that they could be used in a way where I mean, the people who are Asperger's can oftentimes be really good at like something like coding today, where it's like they're really good at debugging systems. They're really good at seeing, seeing very quickly, the flaw in something. And so what he said, so it was named after him, where he was just like saying, okay, these people are different. They're not mentally deficient. And so he lumped them together. And so they are really what many people would call high functioning autism. And what happened with the DSM-5 when they created the spectrum, they just merged the two, and so they have different origins. And to me, once again, it's just we're talking about a lot of different conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, there's well, Jeff, do you have a question you're eyeing you would like to ask?
Well,
Okay.
I'll come up with one after you finish.
Okay. Well, Diane, thank you so much for all that you're sharing with us. We're getting a lot of great questions in. And Baba Joy 2432, that's their YouTube name, asks, do you believe all non-speaking autistic people have these abilities to communicate telepathically?
Um, I really don't know. I mean, I that's it's kind of it's a hard thing to assess because and the reason why I say that is that I look at it from a couple of different angles. Okay, so one angle is you have people like Susie Miller, who was a speech therapist who walked away from doing speech therapy after she had this experience with this boy, where she says she saw this body of light above him. Okay, so that's how her and the boy said, that's my light body. And she's like, well, oh, yeah, so that caused her to, move away from doing speech therapy to really doing kind of spiritual work with these children. And she would tell you that I've evaluated thousands of these children and they're all telepathic. She would say that. And I've met other speech therapists who would say the same thing, that, all of the kids that I've worked with are telepathic. Okay. Um, and then you'll have other speech therapists who say, no, these kids aren't telepathic. They haven't run into it. So it's kind of like, well, maybe it's because they have a firm belief that it's impossible. And so you can't see what you don't expect to see. That, there's that bias, confirmation that enters in. Um, Yet, and then you have other speech therapists that are trying to legitimize spelling, and they don't want to admit that these kids are telepathic because they're trying to legitimize spelling, which is pointing to a letter board as you and literally spelling out what you want to say as a form of communication. And you have the Speech and Language Association that regulates, what they do, saying that it's a debunked form of communication. There's no there. And the people who do this work with them are saying, no, wait a minute, no, these kids really are communicating. And so a lot of them discover that the child can read minds, but they don't want that to get out there, because then they think that what's going to happen is that it'll just add fuel to the fire of the skeptics who want to shoot down spelling itself. And so there's been a silence among that, population as well. And so so there's so you don't, so that could be another reason why you don't have all of the speech therapists on board with this, because it's because of that. And then another angle by which I look at it, though, is that if you look at the incidence of autism today, it's about 5 million children in the US.
Whoa.
Of that 5 million, a quarter of them are non-speaking. So that means that, like, 1 million+ children in the US alone, let alone the world, fall into the non-speaking category. And, over the course of 13 years that I've been, actively studying these children, I've had, maybe 100 families contact me. It was around, in the 60s, and then it's gone up. But after the telepathy tapes, I've heard about more children. But that's a small percentage of 1 million children. And so I see it as it's a possibility that they're all telepathic. It's also possible that that they're not, and I really can't answer it.
And maybe they all have a variation of the ability, just like I think the general public.
Yeah, and that's what I think, is that I think that they're really, yeah, they probably are like the general public in that that there's different levels of it. The ones that the parents who tend to contact me are the ones who see it with this 100% accuracy. That they're the ones who just say, I can't think something without my child um, knowing it.
Mm,
And and then, but on top of that, the reason why they contact me is because they it was not the way that they saw the reality. They're shocked, and they go, "Oh my gosh, how could this be possible? How could this child be reading my mind?" And yet here it is, irrefutable, in front of me. Um, and then they do an internet search, and then they find me and contact me. So so that's going to be a smaller percentage of people.
mhm.
Because you have to spend the time with the child to actually see it.
Mhm.
And, so, yeah, so I really want to explore that and find out to what degree.
Yeah, and I know here on New Thinking Aloud, we certainly, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, we encourage these abilities, and perhaps some of these parents may discourage them. And I know that happens even in the general public, that that can happen, where I think the research shows that, and Diane, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, that around ages 4 to 7, that just people in general tend to be more psychic and intuitive, and that if a family encourages those abilities, they're more likely to have that as they grow in life, although they can certainly regain it later to some degree. But if that's discouraged, that can really shut down for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, and if you think about it from the perspective of brain function, the frontal lobes, which I said earlier, are play a role in kind of our, our expectations of, what we think would be the consequences, or, um, and and so what's possible, and that's reduced activity during dreaming sleep. Well, um, those frontal lobes are not fully hooked up to the rest of the brain and inhibiting the posterior parts of their brain until much later on, which is why you see sort of attention issues in small children, because they um, they're more in the eternal now.
Hmm.
And there's both the good and the bad of that. And but so anyway, so I think that so what's happening is that the frontal lobes become more and more connected, then and they get more and more sort of indoctrinated, if you will, into a materialist paradigm, that these things tend to go underground. There's such a desire to fit in. And if it's not something that's socially sanctioned, and if it's in fact stigmatized, it'll go underground, because the need to fit in is and be um, loved, and is so high. And so what I've seen is that sadly, some of the children that I've worked with, who were very telepathic, um, when they had some relatives who they were close with, like a grandmother who were Christian, who treated it as though this was, work of the devil, or, bad to do, then it just, they just totally shut the whole thing down.
Yet Christ was a mystic.
Mhm.
And most, if not all, religions are based on these abilities and prophets and so forth. So there's definitely a cognitive disconnect there as well. Also, you found that not only are these children telepathic and can communicate with their close loved ones who do encourage it, or maybe there's more of a love bond, or there's some reason those connections happen. You also found that these children, some of them reported that they could communicate non-verbally, telepathically with each other. Could you share more about that?
Um, yeah, so I've been hearing for ever since when I went to India, um, like 14 years ago, I've been hearing accounts that these children can be telepathic with one another. That was something that this woman who invited me over there told me, and I thought, well, that's very interesting. I mean, that'd be an interesting thing to test. But those were children who were all in who knew one another because they would go to the same kind of center. And then I met another person who worked with these autistic kids, who created a school for them, and she discovered that they're telepathic, and she said, oh, they're telepathic with one another. And so I heard it from her. And so I heard pockets of it, but it was always this group of kids who also knew each other in kind of this realm, the sort of this 3D world here. And so it wasn't until I went to Atlanta and met John Paul and Houston that I heard them talk about the hill, and they, that there's this, this place that's, outside of this sort of reality, where they can meet one another non-locally, and that there are kids from, other parts of the country that they've never met that they can meet there. And so that's the first time I heard that concept.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like mutual dreaming.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Several people have been asking about the scientific receptivity to your work. And I'm under the impression, especially from our conversation before we formally began the program, where now you are hired to do a investigation of some of the reported psionic assets that the program, whatever that is, have been recruiting in researching UFOs, and apparently attempting to lure UFOs to land so they can be captured, on the one hand. And on the other hand, when your book first came out, you were ostracized from the psychiatric community. So it seems as if it's scientific receptivity has gone from minus to plus over the years.
Yeah, well, it's always been a mixed bag, because when I wrote my book, The ESP Enigma, it was actually, and that was, it was published in 2008. That was favorably reviewed by my medical school, Johns Hopkins, and because it's written you've read it, it's written in a scientific way, and so, but at the same time, my medical board just reacted to the title of it. And, it kind of like, how dare a psychiatrist, put in the same, title, the ESP Enigma, a scientific case for, ESP, or psychic abilities. How could I say that there could even be a scientific case made for them?
How ignorant when you consider that Freud wrote about it.
I know, I know. It's well, I mean, when you go through medical school and you're training, especially if you become trained as a psychiatrist, you're taught that if anybody says certain things,
Mm.
that it's an automatic sign that they have mental illness.
Mm.
And it's all of those things that are in parapsychology. If anybody says they have any of these abilities, then they need to be put on an antipsychotic. And so a lot of people are afraid to report these things to a psychiatrist. And if you have somebody with my credentials as a psychiatrist actually giving any kind of credibility to these abilities, it's particularly dangerous. I mean, it's one thing for somebody who is some other medical doctor or a psychologist or whatever to do it, but a psychiatrist, I mean, you are the gatekeepers as to what is sanity and not, and insanity. And so that's much more problematic. And it just goes against what they were trained, and of course, like how many doctors go against what they were trained and are willing to put themselves out there in a public way to say that, so it's sort of like, well, this woman must be crazy, but I proved my sanity. I underwent psychological testing, and they like, okay, well, I guess that's not it. I guess she's just eccentric. But so that was the reception back then, and I'd say more recently, you still have the people that want to shoot it down. You still have the diehard skeptics, um, and um, and then you have other people that it opens them up. They're like, wow, it's giving them permission to say that they've had their own experiences, whether it was personally or with a patient or whoever, and so I think there's been a lot of change that's occurred over the last decade, for sure. And because people are realizing that understanding consciousness, which was something that you weren't even allowed to say was your area of research interest, that understanding consciousness is really critical at this juncture, that we're at a pivotal moment, that we really need to understand what is the nature of consciousness. You have these UAPs that are showing up, and people are like, what is that? What's going on here? And so it's reached a point where these things have to be investigated, and they have to be done so in a way that is rigorous.
Well, I want to point out to our listeners and viewers that we're at the top of the hour, just about, and we'll be continuing for another half hour with Diane. And since you brought up the question of UAP and UFOs and psionic assets, we did mention briefly before the program officially began that there is some overlap between your work with autistic children and this area that most people might think was completely separate. So can you address that overlap a little?
Yeah. So, I mean, at least a decade ago, I was told by various scientists who were, um, while Edgar Mitchell was still alive, and he created Free. Do you remember Free?
Yeah.
So I was told that they wanted me to be part of that group, and I was like, well, initially I was like, well, what does my work have to do with these UFOs was what they were called back then. What does my work have to do with that? And they said, well, because you're an expert on telepathy, that's what you're studying, and telepathy is central to our understanding contact. The contact experience is always the telepathic one that seems to go beyond a need to have a common language, which is what I see in these autistic kids is that they don't have to have a common language. In fact, they can, they can be telepathic with somebody whose language is totally different than theirs, and they're even able to communicate in that language, with the spelling. So, so I think that that's the connection. And then, of course, now, with people having all of these sightings, people are wondering, okay, well, how do we find out the reality and the truth of what's going on here? And so I think that there's a big interest, a surge in interest in what it is I do.
Mhm. Do you have any knowledge or thoughts about the idea that for some time the government may have been recruiting young children for the purpose of engaging telepathically with non-human intelligence?
Um, I don't have any knowledge of that, but it wouldn't surprise me. Um, and the families of these children are very wary of anything that would, put them into a situation where the kids get exploited, and there's a fear of exploitation that, um, they're very protective of these kids, and I'm protective of the kids too, because uh, it's not, they need to be, yeah, they just need to be protected. Their identities need to be protected. And they themselves are very, they're very pure souls that are here to want to help humanity. And, one never knows, what people's agendas are, and so it would have to be with the best intentions.
The reports I have heard don't specifically mention autistic children at all, but do refer to children from indigenous cultures where there was never any prohibition against psychic functioning.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I am an honorary member of an indigenous tribe, and I've worked quite extensively with a spiritual elder of that tribe, and he is one of the most psychic people I've ever met. And it's true that a lot of indigenous people have these abilities. Um, and uh, and I didn't realize until he told me that that reservations, that even though reservations are places where indigenous people were given sovereignty, so they're considered a sovereign nation, the federal government still owns that land. And so there is a military presence at some of these reservations. Um, and so it wouldn't surprise me if there, were programs that, were ongoing, maybe,
Mhm.
wouldn't surprise me.
Mhm. Well, I imagine that in this work that you've been recruited to do, you'll have more exposure to this sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's, yeah, and mainly, trying to just understand the phenomenon itself, it's, because it's pretty mind-blowing, some of these reports. And I don't really know quite what to make of them, but it's an interesting it's an interesting thing to explore.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned earlier that Jake Barber, the whistleblower who claims that as a helicopter pilot, he has been asked to hoist non-human vehicles and take them to different locations, that he's already stated you're part of his team.
He said that, but I've never met him, and and I think he's just I think he was excited to know that I know the person who's hired him, and he's excited after hearing the telepathy tapes that someone who understands, to the extent you can understand telepathy, that is someone that he has the potential to meet someday. So I think it was out of that enthusiasm. And my background in neuropsychiatry, neuroscience I think it could be very helpful in this regard to just understand. But especially since you have Gary Nolan, who's um, gone out and described differences in the caudate and putamen in individuals who have some of these abilities, and so he's interested in seeing whether or not that holds true with others.
The caudate and putamen, for our viewers who may not know, are substructures within the brain.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you mentioned earlier that the young autistic savants sometimes refer to contact with deceased individuals. Do they ever talk about non-human intelligences that we might associate with UFOs?
Yeah, they don't really use the word non-human intelligence, but they do. Yeah, they'll talk about there being both good, kind of good and bad energy, spirits out there, and some of the individuals who are neurodivergent, which is another term that gets used instead of autism, and I actually like the term neurodivergent better because it's addressing that issue of the, their wiring of these kids is different. Um, And, some of the neurodivergent people who can draw, so they don't have the loss of the sensory motor abilities, and so they can draw. Some of them have shown me, uh, drawings or paintings that are obviously, your classic sort of grays, or, sometimes it's, or these angelic beings, and I would say that I hear more reports of the angelic type beings than I do of the ones that are not angelic. Um, and I wonder whether or not, and this is just a hypothesis I have, that the kind of beings that you attract really depends upon your state of consciousness. That if you yourself are living in this space of love and that kind of consciousness, then the kind of beings that you're going to have more experiences with are going to be sharing that kind of way of being.
Yeah, we've had a guest, Robert Falconer, on who Jeff has interviewed a few times, who is a internal family systems therapist who has said just that essentially. And we've had him as a live stream guest as well, that if a person has unresolved thoughts, emotions within themselves based on previous events or their own thoughts and beliefs about themselves, that can attract, shall we say, some of those, what some might refer to as negative forces. And so while yes, he assists people with those forces, he really suggests that people explore within and work with somebody to evolve or heal those parts of themselves. That's really paramount to what you just said. Yeah.
Mhm.
So we have a question from a person whose YouTube name is World Missed Light, and they ask, how can an average person enhance savant skills?
Um, well, I think that, first of all, I think that meditation is helpful. I think that really quieting that monkey mind is essential. I think that practice, because it really appears that I mean, some people are innately more gifted, but that it is a trainable ability. I mean, a lot of people who thought that there wasn't something that they could do, that they found that with training they could. Um, I think that engaging in processes that to either balance the two hemispheres or, kind of get you out of just that left brain kind of a, approach to things and doing more sort of what we associate with right hemisphere um, skills, that those kinds of things would be helpful.
Like
And
being in the present moment and in the flow versus thinking about the past or the future, maybe
yeah,
play some of those activities that bring you out of maybe worry or fear. Is that right?
yeah. Well, I would say that. I'd also say just engaging in artistic pursuits.
Yeah. Creativity.
Yeah, and I'd also say that really working on being loving and compassionate. I think that there's a frequency to that, that there's a vibration to that, if you will, that seems to be really conducive.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeff and I just
Or-
co-authored a piece about that in the New Thinking Aloud magazine about how love and compassion seems to support these abilities. So I love hearing that you say that because what the world needs now is love, sweet love.
Right, right. We need a lot more of that. That's right. You can't get too much of it. Let me say that.
Totally agree. I totally agree. It's hard sometimes to talk about because a word like love gets so overused in our culture and commercialized so that it loses its impact. I guess maybe compassion
Mm.
is a little more effective
Mhm.
as a word.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Which is
Here's
also which is also trainable. Yeah. Sorry, Diane.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you know, the word love gets tossed around in ways that, yeah, that it's, people will say, I love you out of, yeah, like, well, obligation. And it kind of, it changes that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking, we're actually talking about, engaging in practices in which you can feel that love. And it may be that you need to start with something that's easy for you to love, like your puppy or your child or whatever, and then try to expand that. Try to expand it, keep that feeling, but expand it outside of the more narrow confines in which it comes naturally to you. And so like you go out in public and you see somebody and you open the door for them, a really kind act, and then and then you see how they respond to you, and that exchange creates a warm feeling in the heart. And the more that we can be in those acts of kindness and and a heart-based sort of way of being, the more easily the love is going to flow through us and not get disrupted by some of the kind of harsh impersonal things, or one of the things that's really toxic is like listening to the news, which is like so fear-based and just like let me give you one thing after another that if I don't have you afraid yet, wait till I tell you the next story. I mean, that kind of thing, it's like it takes people out of the space that they really that they need to be in. And for not just it's not just about developing these abilities, it's about being healthy and whole.
Mm. Yeah, very well. Very well
Here's
said.
a question from a viewer named Mel LaRosa, who asks, and maybe this is the flip side of the idea of the importance of love. He says, if telepathy becomes widely accepted, what ethical concerns should we anticipate with regard to privacy and consent?
Um, well, as I said earlier, it's not like these. My experience of these children is it's not that they can read everybody's mind. I mean, and so if you don't if you don't give them permission, if you don't develop that bond with them, that's a really harmonious bond, I don't think it's going to happen so much. And so people who are shut down and very private, you could probably keep your privacy, okay? Don't feel threatened by these, these kinds of individuals, okay? Um, and the people who let that guard down experience it as a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
And so, I think what we have to do is we need to clean our consciousness fields. Yeah, like, people need to, engage in introspect. What is it you're trying to hide, and why are you trying to hide it? And are you really effective at hiding it? You're not hiding it from yourself. And why is that something that is so shameful? If we can address our own shadows, we will evolve as individuals and spiritually. I mean, I think that shadow work is essential. And so people who worry about such things, it says to me that um, they haven't really done the shadow work, which may sound scary. But what happens is when people engage in it, there's a sense of relief. And it shines light on the shadow, and the shadow becomes smaller.
Mhm.
Here's a related question from Carrie Ann Chrysler, who asks, or who makes a statement and says, strange how nonconformity is seen as crazy. Why is compliance the wisest way? Why should people conform?
Well, I'd say that conformity is not the wisest way necessarily. But it's the safest. People are looking for security. People are looking for safety, and there's safety in numbers. And so if everybody is doing XYZ, then if you want those numbers, then you do XYZ too.
Yeah, and that also speaks to tribalism or the othering that happens a lot, where people get into their groups and can stay firmly in them. Here's a question from a couple of people. One is, I believe, a volunteer of ours, and I may not pronounce their name correctly, so my apologies. Padre Gomira. And then another YouTube listener whose name is Age of Coral. They ask a similar question about, has there been any evidence of contact with the afterlife in the research of these subjects? And how do autistic savants contact the afterlife? Is that something you've come across? Or even pre-life or post-life or
Oh, yeah, I mean, I've heard all kinds of stories that are along those lines. So for example, there are children who say that they remember past lives. And one child gave some very, specifics, about the past life that she remembered. Um, and she also claims that she was Pope John Paul II um, in her last life, which is kind of an interesting thing. It'd be interesting to see if there was any way in which she could give us some information that um, she wouldn't have privy to. I mean, with the internet, and when you're talking about past life as a famous person, it really complicates things in terms of trying to, to do anything about, validating that. And then there are other individuals that I'd say a fair number of these individuals say that they see deceased relatives of theirs. So they'll, for example, there might be a grandparent who died before they were ever born, and they start typing about, oh, um, your father is over there in the corner, and this is what he had to say. And they give very specific information that the person goes, oh my gosh, I never, how does this child know that? And this one teacher in Chicago, Maria, she had several children in her office that not only were um, telling her about some of her dead relatives being in the office, which, I mean, it freaked her out. I mean, she contacted me. She had contacted me when she first found out that they were reading her mind. And then she contacted me about this because it wasn't something she was thinking about at the time. And then one day the children, um, one of the children said uh, that this deceased relative was saying that another one of her uh, relatives, who was a cousin, is going to be joining him soon. And um, and sure enough, that cousin died within a month. And then it happened again for her. Where so it was this somehow this being that was a deceased relative already knew that someone else that was a relative was about to die. So I mean that's all very profound, and I what I'd love to do is I'd love to do the kind of research like people like Gary Schwartz or Julie Beischel or people that have actually formally studied the mediumship of individuals to see whether or not it can be demonstrated that way. Um, uh, but I haven't had the opportunity to do that.
Mhm. So we have a question from TL who asks, have you submitted your research to publications or has it been published, your research in like Nature, American Psychologist, Science, or maybe other publications? And also, just to dovetail on that, I'm wondering what, I mean, you just mentioned something there, but what do you want or would like to see happen with what you're discovering with these people?
Um, okay, well, so your first question, so I mean, I published an article in Edge Science years ago about my research that I did with Haley and Ramses and Akil. And I also cite articles with children similar to them that are from, 90 years ago or so. And but the problem with that article is that Edge Science is not in the PubMed indices, and so if people are trying to search for publication from me, they're not going to find it in the PubMed indices. And the reason for that is basically that I've been doing this research on my own, self-funded from my medical practice. And in order to get something published in a peer-reviewed journal, you have to go through an independent review board. And if you're not at a university, then that doesn't come free to you. You have to hire a private IRB, and that costs $8,000 or so. I mean, it's a substantial amount of money to put out there. And so I never really felt like, and that's really, usually people apply for an IRB because you have a lot of individuals that you want to study, and you want to get a grant. And at times when I tried to get a grant, the competition for research and parapsychology funding is so stiff that it's just a lot of competition, and
Very
and
little
the time that
funding.
yeah, and the time that it took me to write this grant, if I'd spent that doing my medical practice, I would have helped all those people, and I would have had enough funding to do it. And so I just stayed in the self-funding mode. So what's happening now is that I'm working with Marjorie Wollicott, who's on faculty at the University of Oregon, and Marina Weiler, who's at DOPS, University of Virginia. And what I've done is I've given them access to videos of some of my experiments, and we're applying for an IRB so that we can do a study and write a paper that's them and I commenting about the studies that have already been done. It's kind of like a retrospective study. And then we'll be submitting that for publication. And then additionally, I've written, co-authored an IRB to do research with scientists at the University of Arizona to do simultaneous QEEG recordings, and to see if is there a specific brain function pattern that shows up, that they all seem to exhibit? Is there synchronization between the telepathic pair, et cetera? And then pairing that with questionnaires so that we can look at the brain activity and see how that correlates with whether or not they say they see the answers or hear the answers, or just a whole host of other questions.
We have just a few minutes left. This is a big question, but it's going to require a relatively short answer. Joel Erie is concerned about the use of, or not the use, he's concerned about theories of consciousness, and he wants to know if you have a favorite theory that could account for the kind of phenomena that you're encountering. And he suggests, for example, the work of Stuart Hameroff, who is trying to correlate consciousness with the theories of Roger Penrose, the Nobel laureate, concerning the quantum functions of consciousness in the brain. Are you predisposed towards any particular theory of consciousness?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been aware of Hammeroff and Penrose's work for, 20 years. I've presented at their Science of Consciousness conference. And when I was first approaching this whole sort of, how is Savant syndrome possible, I was thinking about it from the standpoint of a quantum model, that there's quantum processing in the brain, and in addition to a more classical processing, I think that we've got more than one kind of modality that's going on. But I've taken it even further from the standpoint, and you get into microtubules with their work and as being the place where that quantum processing would occur because of the structure that it has. But I've taken it further in that um, I really believe that consciousness is primary. And when I wrote a chapter for the first volume of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, that it is consciousness primary. I thought about it, quite deeply, and I thought, uh, that could explain everything. If we just flip it, if we instead of thinking of the brain as what creates consciousness, if we really think of the brain as being what helps us to decode consciousness, that consciousness is something that's more like a field.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Diane. We're delighted to have the opportunity to share your important work with our audience. I want to also let our viewers know, if they're not already subscribers to our weekly newsletter, it will give you advance notice of all of our videos for the coming week and many other exciting announcements concerning books and other events. And you can subscribe to our newsletter by going to New Thinking Aloud, all one word, .org. And Emmy, would you like to share anything final with our viewers?
Well, I just have a mini quick question for Diane, which is, what is the implications of this phenomena for all of us in general, all of us who share this collective consciousness that's primary?
I have somebody at my door, so I'm
Oh, well,
distracted
maybe we
right.
need to just wrap up and continue another time. We can do that. Well, great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Diane, for all that you're doing. And also, not only for the ways that this helps us listening to you, but specifically for these children, where a lot of them I know are really suffering, and that what you're offering is a way for them to perhaps, as you say, have um, a life full of more love, joy, peace, and well-being. So thank you for that.
Hey, you're welcome. All right. Thank you.
I'll catch you next time. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, I told
It's going to be here for a minute.